Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Michael Mainelli. I'm the Mercer School Memorial Professor of Commerce, and I'm pleased to welcome you to Gresham College tonight. I'm also pleased to find that there are so many risk-seeking people who are daring enough to take a chance on tonight's lecture. Or should I ask if you are just risk-averse to tonight's television schedule? Well, as you know, it wouldn't be a commerce lecture without a commercial. So I'm glad to announce that the next commerce lecture will continue our theme of better choice, but that's not until the autumn, and that'll be Wednesday, the 12th of September, here at Barnard's Inn Hall at 6 p.m. And an aside to any Securities and Investment Institute, Association of Chartered Certified Accountants, or other CPD attendees, please be sure to see Jeff or Dawn at the end of the lecture to receive your CPD points or obtain a certificate of attendance. Well, as we say in commerce, to business. We would all like a riskless life, yet society's adherence to the precautionary principle and some of our knee-jerk responses to disasters can actually worsen our risks. So tonight's theme could probably be parodied as, you can't have everything in moderation, because then you have nothing in proportion. A riskless society is definitely not one in moderation. One intriguing science fiction story examines a riskless society. It's called The Ringworld by Larry Niven, which he wrote back in 1970. Given today's controversies, this novel is interesting in being one of the first to identify that growing civilizations will struggle with global warming. But this sci-fi tale may not be great literature. It also has a couple of other interesting ideas about risk. Now, as always in science fiction, there are some aliens. These are called Pearson's puppeteers. Being descended from herbivorous herd animals, puppeteer morality is based on cowardice. The ruling class is known as they who lead from behind, and the supreme leader is called the hindmost. The puppeteers are so risk-averse that they have moved their world to avoid the possibility of their sun expanding. They've developed a spaceship that in the event of danger, such as winding up inside a star, will hold its occupants in stasis until the star dies around the spaceship. The plot unfolds as the puppeteers discover that a circular ribbon world over 200 light-years away is going to collide with their worlds in the distant future. Scared into doing something, they send an emissary to assemble an investigatory mission. The emissary chooses 2 humans from an overpopulated world. Niven postulates that luck might be genetic, as the human female is the luckiest person in the world. She is the 6th generation of birth lottery winners. The puppeteer chooses her as her mascot, chooses her as a mascot or a good luck charm for their trip. Now, the book makes 2 points relevant to tonight's essay. Firstly, through fear, the puppeteers have developed very advanced technology, which is a bit of a paradox, given the risks. Secondly, the book postulates that anyone convinced enough to do something about solving global risks might just be insane. Now, a Gresham College audience is rational. We'd like to start with the facts. 1,700 people died in the UK today. This US chart documents the well-known top killers: heart disease, 1 in 5, and cancer, 1 in 7, followed by stroke, 1 in 24, and motor accidents, 1 in 84. But how many people expect to see suicide, 1 in 119, in 5th place, 3 times more likely than firearm assault, 1 in 314? The UK numbers are more striking because firearm assault and other assaults are less common than in the US. The USA's homicide rate is 3 times the UK's, 5.87 per 100,000 to 1.75. People are at greater risk from themselves than from being murdered by others. 8.5 suicides per 100,000 compared with 1.75 homicides. Globally, suicides are about double those of homicides. If anything, suicide may be underreported for a number of religious, social, and insurance reasons, while homicide is widely reckoned to be one of the more reliable global comparative crime statistics. Paul Judge highlighted another mortality oddity, that despite our exaggerated concern for the very young, children up to the age of 14 have a very small chance of dying from external causes. We should more usefully worry about 14 to 20-year-olds and those over 75. From a quick perusal of statistics, one might conclude that public monies would be better spent keeping us away from sharp objects while alone, or away from motor vehicles, than on air safety or rail safety or floods and earthquakes. Yet when 97% of the causes of death are illness or disease and 3% are accidental causes, shouldn't we be putting almost all public monies into healthcare and medical research? This leads us quite rapidly to a basic problem with risk. What are we measuring? Are we trying to measure a steady state level of risk? That is, there is a natural murder rate or disease rate which is unchangeable, or are we trying to find a current number whose target we intend to lower? Given the wide discrepancies in international murder statistics and health, unless you believe that certain national characteristics are inherently violence-prone and unchangeable, many countries could do markedly better, even Britain, say, when compared with Japan. Now, risk in public policy is a very important topic, yet few of us spend our time perusing mortality statistics. Our society is driven by public perceptions of risk. Studies into voluntary and involuntary risks indicate that people are willing to accept the risks associated with activities that they choose to participate in, compared with those over which they have no control. Now, 9/11 and 7/7 changed our lives, from increasing bureaucracy when opening a bank account, to more inconvenient travel, to entering a country. Overseas travelers to the USA have fallen by 17% since 2000. Do you think that world peace is more threatened by terrorism or by larger numbers of people now less familiar or ignorant with today's superpower? Our diets have been changed by BSE, by avian flu, by Sudan 1, by acrylamide, by genetically modified organisms, by pesticides and other food scares. Our children's lives have been changed by the Lime Bay disaster, in kayaking, by increasing awareness over pedophilia, by MMR vaccine controversies, by dangerous dogs legislation, by concerns over obesity and school food. Our work has been changed by health and safety regulations, smoking bans, and rail crashes. Our play has changed. You can't race bathtubs any longer. Volunteers cannot work on cathedral steeples. Our science has been changed by scares about genetic tampering, stem cell research, and nanoparticles, or nano-goo. Perceptions of risk lead to public responses. We often laugh at the unintended consequences that result. For instance, the enforcement of compulsory helmets for cyclists in Australia led to more years of life lost to poor health than lives saved from cycle accidents because people reduced their cycling. Or banning beef on the bone in the UK in 1997, which avoided a risk somewhat more remote than getting hit on the head by a meteorite. Perhaps we need those crash helmets for a different reason. We laugh at anti-suffocation notices on plastic bags for children not old enough to read, or whinge that supermarket plastic bags punctured for safety are thus unusable for wet rubbish. Or we snigger at labels that coffee is hot, following successful lawsuits pointing out that the warning was lacking. Or we bemoan bans on the British Royal Legion selling poppies with pins to remind us of the horrors of war. There is a fairly standard theater of public risk. First, we become aware of a novel risk or new ways of looking at an old risk. If it's interesting enough, a public debate begins. The media finds some new talking head experts to take sides, and then all inflate every hard-won nugget of possible information into an entire series of spam headlines and articles. If the media are successful, they generate so much hue and cry, "Something must be done," that politicians leap in to gain face time. The media, and we, measure success by how much senior ministerial time is spent talking about the problem. Of course, politicians wouldn't be politicians if they didn't believe that the government should or could do something, despite any evidence to the contrary. Frustration levels rise. as everyone realizes that politicians also subscribe to the belief that it doesn't matter what you do, it only matters what you say you've done and what you say you're going to do. Naturally, in the face of public demand, the government has to do something. The government comes up with some quick fixes and hastily implements them in a hurried display of action, simultaneously reinforcing the idea that managing this risk is a governmental problem, while the media gloat that it was us what done it. Meanwhile, the quick fixes, normally regulations or taxes or legislation, have unintended consequences. The chattering classes taught that it was another botched government intervention by the nanny state, while civil libertarians complained that it should have been better thought through, and businesses groan about the costs. Frustration levels rise again when everyone realizes that little works and what little does work costs a lot. Some people throw up their hands and disengage. If frustration is very high, we generate new risk perceptions leading to another cycle and new regulations. The usual course of events is so well known that the Better Regulation Commission summarized it in the report from which this diagram is taken. Now, the Better Regulations Commission's recommendations are rational: provide better information and training on risk, set up a gatekeeping panel to limit government action, which they called the Fast Assessment of Regulatory Options Panel, assess the costs and the benefits before acting, seek non-governmental ways of reducing risk, prune regulation regularly, set clear responsibilities, and measure progress. Their primary recommendation is noble and worthy, but not easy. For the most part, public sector risk initiatives are qualitative and paper-intensive. Government wants civil servants to be risk-aware, but it hands out far more slowly the financial and statistical information needed to manage risk. It's a bit like asking staff to be cost-aware, but not giving them a basic financial system that tells them the actual costs. The recommendation is particularly difficult because risk is always about perception, not fact. Objective odds don't matter. The Chinese recognize that a crisis equals danger plus opportunity. Similarly, literature about risk discriminates among risk as a chance or probability, hazard as a danger or a dangerous object, threat as an indication of an object or condition that could influence the level of risk. For instance, the risk of theft might have a weighted probability of 30,000 pounds. The hazard might be an unlocked door. The threat might be organized crime. A fairly traditional definition is that risk equals severity times likelihood. But likelihood is always a future perceived likelihood, not an objective reality. Thus, risk is always a subjective perception. Niels Bohr, the physicist in a slightly different context, pointed out a crucial truth. An independent reality in the ordinary physical sense can neither be ascribed to the phenomenon nor to the agencies of observation. Change the perception and you change the risk. It's all about people. Ulrich Beck's influential work, Risk Society, from 1986, analyzed our post-industrial, postmodern society in terms of risk transfer rather than wealth distribution. Like Giddens and others, he encourages us to think about reflexive modernity, the feedback and feed-forward effects of risk in the entirety of our social systems. He highlights our difficulties in interpreting science for social purposes, the intractability of incalculability, the multiplicity of risk definitions, and our struggles with causality and legality. Perhaps his most telling conclusion is that in definitions of risks, the science's monopoly on rationality is broken. Ulrich echoes Frank Knight's assessment of the economics of risk. Profit arises out of the inherent, absolute unpredictability of things, out of the sheer, brute fact that the results of human activity cannot be anticipated, and then only insofar as even a probability calculation in regard to them is impossible and meaningless. Profit comes from risk. The inherent potential for political conflict, particularly where low objective risks meet high subjective perceptions of threat, is widely observed. The postmodern conclusions about the political implications of risk focus are strikingly similar in many cases. For example, Sir John Krebs, former chairman of the Food Standards Agency, initiated a workshop at the Royal Society in 2005 that set out principles for risk assessment: stakeholder consultation, an iterative process, transparency about uncertainties, broad engagement, and better communication. You've heard it before. Of course, Donald Rumsfeld made this sentiment famous. His basic theme, and an overriding theme in much of the literature, is that risk is selected through social organizations and that the management of risk is undertaken by organizations. So perhaps the media shouldn't be parodied as Chicken Littles, but applauded for helping us to start to recognize risk. The next point to make is that we often don't know the likelihoods or the severities to calculate risks from hazards. Just to take one case, the odds of asteroids hitting the Earth and the damage they can do are well studied, but still very inexact. Risk and uncertainty, risk where the probabilities of occurrence are poorly known or unknown, play a major part in determining courses of action. Hofstede sounds a cautionary note on cultural differences leading to unsound assumptions. He maintains that attempting to apply organizational theories developed in one country may be unsound in another country. He particularly picks on American theories that have a cultural bias such that the extreme position of the United States on the individualism scale leads to other potential conflicts between the U.S. way of thinking about organization and the values dominant in other parts of the world. Basic cost-benefit analysis highlights our cultural biases. Now, many people object to cost-benefit analysis because it implicitly puts a price on a human life. Yet every safety department has to allocate resources based on costs and benefits. Thus, every quantitative cost-benefit study on safety runs the risk of the media publishing the number that has to be there to do the analysis. The Economist reported back in 1988 that the Department of Transport rebased its financial value of a life to £750,000 for a road accident and £2 million for a rail accident. Your death is a greater loss to society when you take the train. Moreover, the department chose the road death value after examining a range of numbers. You won't be surprised to find that ever cautious and ever cost-conscious, it chose the lowest. Now, before you laugh too much, think of all the dinner party talk about being unfairly caught by police or speed cameras above some speed limit that could have been lower. 55% of drivers admit to exceeding the speed limit a little every day. 70% to 85% of drivers admit to speeding, but distinguish between ordinary, safe speeding drivers and dangerous speeding drivers. Driving at 40 miles per hour in a 30-mile-per-hour zone was seen in one study as more acceptable than dropping litter. James, would you mind running our video, please?
If you hit me at 40 miles an hour, there's around an 80% chance I'll die. Hit me at 30 and there's around an 80% chance I'll live.
Now, Haythornwaite, who is chairman of the Better Regulation Commission, points to this recent road safety advertisement, which shows a young girl lying crumpled on the road, and the concluding message that a child hit by a car traveling at 40 miles per hour has an 80% chance of being killed, while a child hit by a car traveling at 30 miles per hour has an 80% chance of surviving. He observes, It represents some sort of balance, moderated by public acceptability, between the cost to the economy of further slowing down travel times and the benefits of saving the lives of more children. The advertisement implies that 20% of children struck by a car traveling quite legally at the urban speed limit are likely to be killed. In effect, it is saying that this is the optimal level of protection that child pedestrians should enjoy, and that any lower speed limit would be subject to the law of diminishing returns. This is a particularly telling, if inadvertent, example of the trade-off and judgment that our policymakers are obliged to make in regulating to control risk. Of course, this can get interestingly controversial rapidly. Who determines where this 30 mile per hour speed limit applies? Where exactly do child pedestrians become more or less valuable? Is this at the edge of the neighborhood? Beside a motorway? On the continent, our 30 mile per hour speed limit would be either 50 kilometers per hour or 30 kilometers per hour. Are children in the 50 kilometer per hour zones less valuable than British children? Or more valuable in the 30 kilometer per hour zone? In the USA, the comparable 30 mile per hour zone would be about 25 miles per hour. Are American children more valuable than British children? You change the cost-benefit of a life calculation every time you race to make some appointment in your automobile. God's not in heaven. He or she is behind the wheel or in the traffic safety department. Nessus, the puppeteer in the ring world, says the majority is always sane. Thus, a courageous puppeteer isn't merely regarded as insane, but is insane. When it comes to speeding, the majority are God. God normally says a statistical life is worth somewhere between 1 million and 5 million, unless you're in the developing world. A World Economic Forum report, Global Risks 2006, foresaw risks that would remain headline risks, such as terrorism, oil price spikes, fiscal crises, influenza, HIV/AIDS, TB, malaria, and earthquakes. The report anticipated that a number of other risks might move up the global agenda, including climate change, liability regimes, counterfeiting, and electromagnetic fields. Yet it can be too convenient to have these global risk studies. They imply that somebody, somewhere, is at least thinking about these big risks. These known unknowns are somebody else's problem. Adrian Barrett, who's at the back there, got me thinking about the moral hazard of some of these risks in banking operations. He stated, if there is a catastrophe, our customers will understand that we can't service them. Whereas, if we've had a computer glitch, they'll go to our competitors. So we have another conundrum. We are negligent about not addressing risks that are local, but not negligent about risks that knock out the world. Not protecting our building against local flooding is negligent, while not helping to prevent London flooding isn't negligent. Local efforts are displaced by apparent actions, however feeble, from a central or higher authority. Now, one German concept is widely promoted as a basic means of dealing with risk, and this is the Vorsorgeprinzip, or precautionary principle. The precautionary principle is a moral or political principle most often applied in the context of the environment or human health, where the consequences of acting on complex systems may be unpredictable. The precautionary principle embodies the idea that if the consequences of an action are unknown, but are judged to have potential for major or irreversible negative consequences, then it is better for society to avoid that action. The precautionary principle echoes a medical principle found in Hippocrates. It's actually not part of the Hippocratic Oath, but it's now more widely known and clearly stated in Latin as primum non nocere, first, do no harm. The precautionary principle applies to institutions and institutional decision-making processes, as well as individuals. You could say, better safe than sorry. Speaking about science, Sir Martin Rees, here at Gresham College in 2004, said, the threats where the precautionary principle is important are those where even if the probability is low, one is anxious about the potential global consequences, if we are unlucky. The principle, however, does create a lot of problems in both assessing harm and proving harm will not emerge. At one extreme, the precautionary principle excludes cost-benefit analysis. Another deeper problem is discerning action from inaction. Is banning mercury in thermometers, freon in refrigeration, or even carbon dioxide exhaust from automobile engines and power plants removing a risk or taking an action? The precautionary principle, in subtly different guises, is included in the United Nations 1982 World Charter for Nature, the 1987 Montreal Protocol, the 1992 Rio Declaration on Environment and Development, and the Maastricht Treaty itself. In economics, the precautionary principle affects rational decision-making. The irreversibility of possible future consequences presents a quasi-option situation such that a risk-neutral society should favor decisions that allow for more flexibility. More scientific uncertainty as to the distribution of a future risk, that is, a larger variability of beliefs, should induce society to take stronger prevention measures today. Now, in deciding how to apply the principle, analysts may use a cost-benefit analysis that factors in both the opportunity cost of not acting and the option value of waiting for further information before acting. One of the difficulties is that applying the principle in modern policymaking creates an irreducible conflict between different interests, so the debate always becomes political, not scientific. Van Asselt and Vos highlight a paradox of uncertainty and risk that, on the one hand, it is recognized that science cannot provide decisive evidence on uncertain risks, while on the other hand, lawyers and policymakers appeal to science for some kind of certainty. Michael Crichton touched on this in his thriller, State of Fear. He said that the precautionary principle, properly applied, forbids the precautionary principle. It is self-contradictory. The precautionary principle, therefore, cannot be spoken of in terms that are too harsh. An unstated corollary is that precaution should be taken regardless of the risk of any precautionary action. Trying too hard to err on the safe side can lead to us doing something less safe. We need to be cautious about being cautious. The current near-hysterical preoccupation with safety could be, at best, a waste of resources and a crimp on the human spirit, and worse, an invitation to totalitarianism. Now, a humorous take on all this is that the risk-reward calculation for engineers probably looks something like this. Being practical people, engineers evaluate this balance of risk and rewards and decide that risk is not a good thing. The best way to avoid risk is by advising that any activity is technically impossible for reasons that are far too complicated to explain. If that approach is not sufficient to halt a project, then the engineer will fall back to the second line of defense. It's technically possible, but it will cost too much. The precautionary principle also highlights ethical problems in intergenerational risk transfer. The 2006 Stern Review bolstered environmentalist economic foundations with cost-benefit analysis, but critics have particular concerns about the discount rates that were used to analyze longer-term issues such as climate change. Stern found it necessary both to explain the ethical ramifications of discount rates when assessing climate change economics, and he applied a discount rate significantly below those found in typical financial analyses. The importance of discount rates warranted a technical annex, ethical frameworks and intertemporal equity. In the annex, Stern links the principle of protection from harm to the polluter pays. He invokes an ethical imperative that future generations should have a right to a standard of living no lower than the current one, and elaborates a concept of stewardship as a special form of sustainability. Particular aspects of the world should be passed on in a state at least as good as that inherited from the previous generation. He has critics, such as William Nordhaus, professor of economics at Yale, who dispute changing today's discount rate for any specific risk. If the discount rate is altered by politics for one risk, then all discount rate analysis can be altered, and all discount rate analysis becomes political grandstanding. There's a funny economic environmental blog by Hobb and Whitehead, and they posit a reductio ad absurdum argument about discount rates in general. An extra glass of wine for Alexander the Great matters more than all today's capital stock. But the deeper point is that if discount rate analysis applies to intergenerational transfers, the same arguments over climate change apply to pensions, public infrastructure, taxation, biodiversity, or cultural heritage, any long-term investment and return. The precautionary principle directs us simultaneously to undertake strong preventative measures immediately and to keep our options open. In many decisions about risk, we are victims of the illusion of control, the tendency for human beings to believe that they can control or influence outcomes that they demonstrably have no influence over. In 1975, Alan Langer showed that people often behave as if chance events are under personal control. Langer's experiments demonstrated the prevalence of the illusion and that people were more likely to believe they had control where there were skill cues such as choice, competition, familiarity, or involvement. The classic example she used was in craps, where it has been shown that people rolling dice tend to throw harder for high numbers and softer for low numbers. Some people argue that the illusion of control helps people succeed by increasing motivation and persistence. Others point out that undeservedly high estimates of self-efficacy can be maladaptive. For instance, they encourage people to pursue failing courses of action. One study of traders working in investment banks by Fenton O'Creevy and others found that traders who were prone to a high illusion of control had significantly worse performance on analysis, risk management, and contribution to desk profits. Thus, they also earned significantly less. The illusion of control may promote striving towards goals, but it is not conducive to sound decision-making. The illusion also predisposes people to take greater objective risks. In activities where the margins of error are narrow and missteps can produce costly or injurious consequences, personal well-being is probably best served by highly accurate efficacy appraisal. Within all of this, we've seen the emergence of a risk industry. Academics, think tanks, consultancies, and government departments all thrive at the lush watering hole of risk. Take any recognized scare, give it a new twist, and hey presto, the research and policy money arrives immediately. Giddens points out that, paradoxically, scaremongering may be necessary to reduce risks we face, yet if it is successful, it appears as just that, scaremongering. Interestingly, we have come full circle in the risk is perception and the perception is the risk cycle. The media is obsessed with these water cooler stories. The water cooler in America is the coffee machine equivalent of the coffee machine equivalent for colder climates. It's the place where the office workers stand around and gossip. Water cooler stories must have recognizable characters and a developing drama. Today, we have reached the point where computer model predictions are the news. The perception of risk within the models is the news itself. Now, one of the dangers is that this encourages consensus science. Because we've moved beyond publish or perish to citation or obituary, scientists are increasingly seeking to popularize their work. They seek attention. They have to. If anything, while reversing the old bias towards the existing order, we're in danger of replacing it with a bias in favor of novelty for its own sake. Further, and confusingly, this is a novelty in favor of consensus over fact. To paraphrase, knowledge is power, power corrupts, thus knowledge corrupts. For example, current climate change debate scores points based on the number of scientists who believe in climate change, not just on the facts scientists have unearthed, or weaknesses in contrary theories of global warming. The fundamental problem is that science is about seeking knowledge, not popularity. In true science, one correct scientist with a provable theory trumps all gainsayers. Now, for some, the nanny state, class action suits, in a culture where somebody ought to pay and it isn't me, as well as the weakness of confidence in science, implies that we as a society are risk-averse. We invoke the precautionary principle. Simultaneously, though, society may well be risk-seeking. We are not risk-averse in our growing passions for gap years in remote backwaters and exotic locations, for gambling, or for high debt and good living. While we ridicule Carol Midgley's cotton wool kids, Sandra Wint, writing for the Royal Society of Art's Risk Commission, inconveniently points out statistics of injuries and fatalities resulting from accidents in extreme sports indicate that in spite of the possibility of injury or death, people are participating in increasing numbers. Our risk-averse cycle clashes with our risk-seeking cycle over issues of safety and freedom. I would love a calculus of risk based on a conservation of risk equation such that the total amount of risk selection in society had to balance over the population and over time. Sadly, that's not the case. Risk is truly just about perception. People want the upside of reward for the risks they believe they face, but quite naturally expect to be able to slough off the negative impacts if they materialize. We have a spiral of lower and lower responsibility for adverse events. We have an easy debt society where open markets make it simple to take loans, so we have a spiral of higher and higher debt. But all debt involves responsibility. Yet lenders are securitizing debt like mad, so they won't be there when the hot potato of default stops. We've seen this most recently in America with the subprime markets. We gab about how the growth in capital markets, new technology, and new risk products increases our already excellent placement of risk with those who can best bear and gain from it under a postmodern, hyper-safe financial systems. But commercial difficulties do arise from excessive risk-seeking. For example, one-way mortgage renewals, more bankruptcies with less stigma, and easier technology access to finance. All of these things mean that we're loading up on risks such as housing and credit default swaps in the short term, but still feel behind the Joneses in the long term. Our diminished responsibility makes us ripe for more bubbles, along with deeper pain and loss for those who care. In the long term, our risk-seeking society clashes with our need for hard savings and investment returns, affecting our long-term losses and therefore our security. So how might societal risk aversion hurt you and me? There is an obvious case that our own risk aversion can hurt us when we refuse to invest in risky projects over the long term and thus achieve lower long-term returns to pay for things like our pensions. Less obvious is that intergenerational transfers can backfire. Our pensions may not be secure with our children, while their environmental future may not be safe with us. At a simpler level, let's look at how individual risk affects overall supply and demand for risk. Imagine a person whose risks run from neutral, 0, to death, -100, or ecstasy, +100. Now, most people are willing to lop off a little potential ecstasy for a bit of safety. This leads to lopping off risk on the left-hand side of the diagram. But then the cost moves the likely outcome to the right. Thus, the person and society as a whole can be protected against severe outcomes, but wind up feeling behind on average. And this leads us to the problem of framing. It's rare that I ask you to remember a previous lecture, but I must go back to a lecture last year entitled, "Why Do People Play the Lottery? Make Up Your Mind," where we covered prospect theory. In that lecture, I emphasized the importance of framing. People who feel that they are ahead take risk-averse decisions, while people who are behind make risk-seeking decisions. I use prospect theory to explain why people might play the lottery. They take silly risks because they feel that they are behind. We can start to unify risk-averse and risk-seeking behavior that we find in society by recourse to prospect theory. Because society takes on more and more of the responsibility for adverse risks, the chances of seriously adverse outcomes is greatly reduced. But the average outcome for individuals makes them feel worse in framing terms. And this is because of the cost of risk avoidance. Thus, the average person feels that they are more behind. According to prospect theory, when people feel that they are behind, they become risk-seeking. On the other hand, when they're contemplating holes in the safety nets of society, the average person feels ahead. He or she supports sealing those holes so others can't fall through. He or she is risk-averse. The problem is the cost. As society becomes more risk-averse on fundamentals, it fuels its risk-seeking individuals. People start to play lottery-type games more and more, high-risk advancement strategies, long-shot careers. As Bob Giffords pointed out to me, in a world dominated by risk management, it is rational for me to gamble, and gamble more, because the marginal cost for me of managing the risk is greater than the marginal benefit of it making a difference. While we scream that somebody ought to do something, meanwhile we're taking risks to get ahead in the hopes that society covers our backside. So we can fall back on a classic supply and demand curve, contrasting price and quantity for risk. Our price for risk is increasing as we become risk-averse, while our quantity of risk is also increasing due to media supply. Our public risk aversion and our private risk propensity collide. We wind up with higher cost and more risk. Last year, at the Sir Thomas Gresham Lecture in the Docklands, Werner Seifert warned of the dangers of focusing unduly on risk reduction in financial markets. He said, "Capital markets need political support, yet their very functioning undermines the support. As a result, markets are fragile institutions, charting a narrow path between overwhelming government interference and too little government support. The greatest danger for a democratic capital market is not that it will lapse into socialism, but that it will revert to the relationship system, suppressing competition under the excuse of reducing risk." When Friedrich von Hayek described how capitalism helps to safeguard freedom, he emphasized that markets produce spontaneous order. They solve the planning and coordination problem by delegating decisions. So we turn to the question, really, are we under or overprotected? Individuals, organizations, and societies have no choice but to organize in the face of uncertainty, to act as if they know the risks they face. Yet all enterprise incurs risk. But this enterprise is driven by reward, not risk. If we excessively focus on risk, we never innovate. If we over-penalize failure, we get the shameful avoidance of failure rather than the courageous search for the truth, which Powers calls the small print society. Along the way, we destroy personal responsibility. It is worth noting that government, as well as capitalism, is a significant part of this problem of trust. Perversely, overregulation may strike one as the least bad mechanism for enforcement if he or she doesn't pick up the direct costs. Consider the case where I don't trust the legal system for enforcement or feel that taking legal action will cost too much. As an example, imagine that I run a restaurant and want to take a competing but not up to the standard fellow restaurant to court for breaking food safety laws. I know I'll fail in court because the legal system is grossly inefficient and expensive, thus paying taxes for a lot of restaurant inspectors may be a more expensive but acceptable substitute. Lots of government policy is based on the false assumption that people trust government over other organizations. I'm not sure I trust an entity that removes nearly half of everything I gain from me and my family and friends for their higher purposes, but I can see how government officials might believe I trust them if they look at opinion surveys of faith in inspectors contrasted with people's faith in the legal system. People talk of overprotection and underprotection, yet I'd like to live a bit of this life I'm being so protective about. So what is an optimal level of protection How can it be achieved? From the outset, and I think few would disagree, it is neither possible nor desirable to eliminate all risk from our lives. Yet so far, regulation has certainly proved one of the boom industries of the 21st century. Regulation is not a free good. It has significant costs and implications that are often hidden from the immediate view of both customers and the suppliers of the goods and services they buy. Regulators recognize that there is a point beyond which further risk reduction is impractical or unacceptable, but how do they determine where that point lies? Now, whenever I hear not a free good, I think of markets. Whenever I hear optimal and adjusting, for example, perceptions within society about changing speed limits, I think of pricing. I may be a sad person, but it is that free market bias. Regulators are struggling with a crude mechanism. Things are either allowed or they're not. It seems to me that much considered regulation gropes towards developing various settings on enforcement and interpretation. And that brings you back to markets. We have numerous good examples of risk being managed adjustably through markets. For example, the price of your fire insurance is adjustable. We require fire insurance certificates and let the market do the rest. There is too little understanding and too little faith among civil servants and the public as to the extent to which you can trust alternatives to regulation. And yet the UK government has been innovative. It has successfully experimented with a few market-based approaches to risk in the UK, for instance, Pool Re for terrorism reinsurance, or the clinical negligence scheme for trusts in the NHS. In both cases, complex variables are reduced to insurance-style charges that managers can understand and incorporate into their decision-making frameworks. Encouragingly, the public sector is exploring other combinations of markets, risk management, and indemnification mechanisms to handle a number of public asset issues, from healthcare to polluted land. Of course, faced with these problems of societal trust, novel markets to manage risk may arise from within capitalism. A number of observers, such as Robert Schiller at Yale, have looked at the rise of the online gambling markets with interest. Faced with government gridlock on risks, we may find that people want to take their own risk management into their own hands through gambling-like markets. Why not offer other people hedged bets on your risks, your car, your unemployment, your home value, your health? We have microcredit banks, so why not micro-risk firms? There are already some experiments of direct credit lending by individuals to individuals through firms such as Zopa or Prosper. Micro-risk markets are a natural next step, and an early indicator may be a new firm called Hedge Street that provides an electronic marketplace for online investors to trade innovative financial instruments directly with each other, such as the value of their house. Well, we've had a kind of ride through the wild women of risk. We've looked at misinformation, miscalculation, misplacement, and misadventure. These dangerous ladies are all here, but we still end with mistrust. So where do we go? Adams believes that the world with no risk would have no uncertainty, but equally no freedom or individuality, and would result in no progress. Adams defends bad luck, claiming a society which can't accept that accidents happened is destined to be governed by a culture of blame. I sometimes wish our public debate were as much about putting risk back into society, regulation, and business as it seems to be about destroying it. In conclusion, risk is about perception, and bad perceptions imperil us. Thank you. Well, good evening, and thank you very much for your attention. We turn to that fun bit in the evening when you get to make your comments, critiques, criticisms, and observations, which I'm looking forward to. I believe Jeff has a microphone, which is there. And we'll take comments and questions for about 8 or 9 minutes, if we could. Gentlemen here.
Yes, thank you very much for your interesting talk. I wonder whether it's possible for individuals to take a rational approach to the risk, the decisions they make in their lives. It seems to me people like politicians and businessmen often take irrational decisions about risks. For example, in 1990, Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. All the signals were to him, the United States will invade Kuwait, will attack, would attack him. But he just pooh-poohed and said, US bluffing, with the disastrous consequences we know. And the same thing has happened over in the Iraq War, that many people who knew about Iraq, both in Britain and the US, predicted the mess that has happened today. But they were poo-poohed, treated like, told they were traitors or cowards or whatever. And I've seen businessmen, who've gone bust because people advised them not to do something or to do something. And they've just treated the advice with contempt.
Okay. You raise a host of interesting problems there, and I'll probably steer away from the political ramifications, if I might. But if I took the core of your point, it's really, how would it be possible for individuals to be more rational about their decision-making? Is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah. I think the problem we're facing as we're beginning to look at the social sciences, particularly with economics in mind, has been that the models have always been based on concepts of rational behavior. Technically, rational means that anybody presented with the same decision would make the same decisions. Sorry, presented with the same facts or same situation would make the same decision. That is, in a funny sense, the definition of rationality at one extreme. The problem, of course, and what I was trying to highlight in tonight's lecture, is that the inputs to that decision are twofold. One, their values. It's your own set of values that drive your particular decision, and arguably nobody else can make those for you. And secondly, that in the case of risk, your perception matters tremendously, and it's really your perception of future perceived value that matters. So if I'm a dictator looking at making an invasion, I may well have made a rational decision because my assessment of the severity and likelihood of somebody deciding to deciding to contest that would differ perhaps from yours. And this is really where the conundrum starts. There is arguably no such thing as an objective decision, and this is what the social sciences have been struggling with. On the other hand, as we see in areas like behavioral economics, there are biases that humans have, such as the illusion of control, where on average, in large numbers, they seem to act in essentially the same way. And this leads you to the paradox. If you game against that, are you going towards a risk-neutral line, or are you really ignoring the fact that the risk-neutral line is what people really want to decide? So you find yourself in a tough spot there. Another question or comment? Adrian?
Michael, you were talking about markets and the importance of markets in assessing risk. The theory of markets, of course, is that all knowledge is in the market, and therefore price reflects all knowledge. The reality of markets, of course, is that all knowledge is not in the market, that there are some people who have inside knowledge, and therefore they are forcing risk on other people, which they don't realize they're facing. Would you like to comment?
Actually, I'd love to, because it touches on a point I only made towards the end. Adrian, you're quite right. One of the problems with a lot of these leading markets, like the one I mentioned earlier, Hedge Street, is the moral hazard element. I know more than you know about my particular circumstances, so I'm only going to seek health insurance when I've probably got a doctor's note saying I've got 6 months to live and I'm about to die of cancer, at which point I'm very happy to take your insurance policy. So this asymmetry of information causes tremendous numbers of problems. One of the things that I think is lacking from a number of these credit markets, et cetera, is that they're missing the community aspect. That may sound strange to invoke community, but a lot of it is actually about, if you look at the case of Zopa, Zopa is a market where I can go online and offer money which other people can pick up. And the idea really is that between the two of us, we basically break the banks. So we're actually able to offer more money. I'm able to get better rates from you than I would in a bank account, and you likewise are able to borrow more cheaply. The problem, though, on the other hand, with Zopa is it's taken a very kind of monolithic attitude of credit scoring. And so if you contrast Zopa as, say, a first world microfinance operation, quite interestingly, it differs from the very successful microfinance operations that have been so lauded in the developing world. And the principal difference really is that those microfinance operations in India and whatnot are operations where people are vouching for others. So they're actually a genuine microfinance. And I don't think any of these things will really work they work at a technical level, but I don't think they'll work at a commercial level until they find ways of engaging the community. And that's recognizing your point, really, that until you bring more information into the market, you really won't have an efficient market. I'm particularly troubled by recent reports, particularly in this country, that something like 25% of M&A transactions, this was what the FSA was reporting, I believe, last month, seem to have some evidence of front-running, and that's really quite frightening. So whilst I am a big markets fan, I would never claim that they are perfect, and I agree with your point. I think that there's certainly a tremendous amount to be said there. We're currently on an Anglo-American high, which was only exacerbated by my firm's publication with the City of London Corporation last week that London is leading in the Global Financial Centres Index. But it's not so long ago we were admiring the German model where the banks were actually highly involved in a more of a community way with the firms, with the Japanese model. So I wonder sometimes if this disassociation, this commoditization of risk both hides information on the one hand and on the other hand is actually making us less efficient. And I think that was part of the point there behind those sort of clashing cycles of higher debt, is you see that the circulation of this is leading us potentially into some longer term disasters. I'm particularly scared over things like in the housing, in the lending markets, where you see that we're able to slice this risk so finely that the person who actually sells the product in the first place is long gone by the time any recourse comes. And so we're sort of playing a very large numbers game. We shall see, I'm afraid. That's the other thing. Any last comments or questions? One more.
This is more in the line of a comment than a question. Your reference to engineers earlier struck a note, as I am a retired engineer. One of the things that was always quite noticeable, remarkable to us, was the very low tolerance of risk by the general public to a building failure compared to the risk that public were perfectly prepared to take on their own behalf. So for, the sort of thing within the general ambit relates to rail travel and car travel. Everyone's well aware that travel by car is infinitely more dangerous than travel by rail or aircraft, but one train crash leads to a politician saying, I don't care what it costs, we will put in ATP in every train. He's found out what it costs and they're not in every train. But there is a major dichotomy between the risk that a person will take on for themselves compared with what they will accept that they have no input to.
I alluded to that as well in the talk, and I agree with you. There's numerous studies pointing out that when people feel that they are in control of a decision, they'll accept a higher level of risk and even accept that they pay more for it. And you can see that even in just daily life. You know, if somebody dies of obesity, people are far less sympathetic to them than if they die of some mysterious ailment they've never heard of. And then we get the mid-type cases where people are concerned about whether or not a certain situation was brought on by actions you've taken. So it's this ability of personal action. Of course, you combine that intriguingly, I think, with something like the illusion of control, and you can imagine really canny people designing situations where you're supposedly in a train, but we're all driving it together in some way. So we feel that we're in control of the train or the aircraft. And then how would that affect our view of what the risk level was? I don't know. Well, folks, you've been very patient, and as you know, Gresham starts on time and mostly ends on time. It's 7 o'clock. For those of you who have the time, my firm is hosting a drinks reception next door in the headmaster's room, where I will be with a number of friends, and you're very, very welcome to join us. For those of you who have to go, may I say thank you so much for taking the time on such a cold and wet evening to come and listen, and I hope to continue a discussion with many of you next door. Thank you.